Chained Hearts, when two female prisoners fall in love in silence. The first time Mara saw her, she was being dragged through the corridor of Greystone Women's Correctional facility by two guards who looked like they had long stopped seeing the women in their care as human beings. The new inmate's wrists were raw beneath the metal cuffs. Her dark hair matted against her forehead from the rain outside, and her eyes, those eyes, were the color of deep water before a storm. Not afraid, not broken, just watching everything with a quiet, devastating calm that made the entire cell block go still. Mara, who had spent 3 years learning how to feel nothing, felt something crack open in her chest that she would spend the next several months desperately trying to seal shut again. Her name was Selene. That was all anyone knew at first. She didn't speak during intake processing. She didn't flinch when the guards cataloged her belongings and handed her a folded uniform that smelled of industrial bleach. She didn't cry when the heavy door of cell block D slammed behind her with the kind of finality that had made grown women weep on their first night. She simply sat on the edge of her assigned bunk, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the ceiling as though she were reading something written there that no one else could see. Mara watched from across the common area, pretending to read a paperback she had already finished twice, and told herself she was only curious. She was not curious. She was already, without a single word exchanged, completely undone. Greystone was the kind of place that hollowed people out slowly. It was not violent in the dramatic way that films portrayed. There were no constant riots, no Hollywood chaos. It was violent in the quiet way, in the fluorescent lights that buzzed without pause, in the meals that tasted of nothing, in the counting of hours that bled, into days that bled into seasons you only noticed because the small window at the end of the hallway shifted, from pale gray to pale yellow and back again. Mara had arrived at 26, convicted of financial fraud she had committed to pay her dying mother's medical bills, and sentenced to 5 years. She had no family left to visit her. She had learned to build walls, the way other women learned to build alliances, and with precision, with patience, and with the understanding that softness was a liability she could not afford. But Selene dismantled those walls without ever trying. She did it through silence, which was the one thing Mara had not thought to defend against. They worked in the same section of the prison laundry during morning shifts, feeding sheets through the industrial press side by side without being required to speak, and yet something passed between them in that silence that felt louder than any conversation Mara had ever had. Selene would occasionally glance sideways at her with those storm-colored eyes, not smiling, not performing anything, just looking as if she could see the exact shape of Mara's loneliness and recognized it because it matched her own. Mara began waking up 10 minutes before the morning bell, just to have time to compose herself before seeing her. The other women noticed before either of them acknowledged it themselves. In the compressed world of a women's correctional facility, privacy is a mythology and tenderness is a spectacle. There were whispers and there were looks, the kind that ranged from knowing to cruel, and Mara absorbed all of them without expression because she had learned how. What she could not absorb was the afternoon in the 4th month when Selene slipped a folded piece of paper across the laundry table without looking up from her work. Mara waited until she was alone in her cell to open it. Inside, in handwriting that was careful and small and somehow terribly sad, were 3 words: "You are seen." Nothing more. No signature, though none was needed. Mara sat with those 3 words for so long that the lights dimmed for the night without her noticing, and she realized, with the slow devastation of someone recognizing something irreversible, that she was in love with a woman she had never once spoken to. This is the moment you may want to pause and ask yourself whether you have ever been truly seen by another person, not the version of you that performs survival, but the version that exists underneath all of it, frightened and hoping and still, despite everything, reaching. If that question touches something in you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more stories like this one reach the people who need them most. Their first real conversation happened not by design but by consequence. A guard known for casual cruelty had targeted Selene during an inspection, manufacturing a violation where none existed, and Mara, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of keeping her head down, stepped forward, without thinking, and provided a quiet, factual, irrefutable witness account that redirected the situation entirely. Afterward, in the yard during the brief window of outdoor time, Selene sat beside her on the concrete bench and said, in a voice Mara had never heard but somehow already knew, that she did not need protecting. Mara told her she knew that. She said she had not done it to protect her. She had done it because watching someone be treated as less than human had become something she could no longer endure quietly. Selene was silent for a long moment, and then she said that she had been silent her whole life. That silence had been the only safe thing she knew, and that hearing Mara speak on her behalf had felt like someone opening a window in a room that had been sealed for years. That was how it began, not with romance in any conventional sense, but with two women slowly learning to breathe in each other's presence. They talked during laundry shifts and during meals when the noise of the cafeteria created a kind of privacy. Selene told her about the community she had tried to build for homeless LGBTQ youth in her city, about the funding that disappeared, about the desperate decision she had made to keep the shelter running that had ultimately cost her her freedom. She spoke about it without bitterness, but with a grief so deep and so quietly held that Mara felt it like pressure in her own ribcage. She told Selene about her mother, about the hospital, about the numbers she had moved, through accounts with shaking hands, while her mother slept in the next room, hoping that love could justify anything. Selene listened the way very few people ever had, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving every word as though it mattered. What grew between them was not simple, and the world they lived in made certain it could never be easy. There were consequences for closeness in Greystone. A particularly hostile guard made a point of separating them during work assignments. For 2 months following a moment he had witnessed between them, and not even a touch, just a look, just the particular quality of stillness that existed between two people who had become necessary to each other. During those 2 months, they communicated through notes tucked into the spines of library books, through a visual language they had developed without planning it. A certain way of holding eye contact across the cafeteria, a deliberate slowing of pace in a corridor when passing each other, small and silent signals that said, "I am still here," and "I have not forgotten you, and whatever this is, it is real." Mara had not imagined, when she arrived at Greystone, that she would discover within its walls the most honest relationship of her life. She had not imagined she could discover anything within its walls except how to endure. The change came gradually and then all at once, the way most important things do. A new program coordinator arrived at Greystone, a woman who had spent her career advocating for humane prison conditions and who moved through the facility with quiet authority and genuine attention. She noticed the women who had been overlooked. She restructured work assignments based on skills rather than punishment. She created a small shared library space with a table and chairs where women could read together during evening hours. It was a small thing. It sounds like a small thing. But for Mara and Selene, it was the first space they had ever occupied together that did not feel like a battleground. They sat across from each other at that table with books open in front of them that neither of them was reading, and Mara reached across and placed her hand over Selene's very quietly, the way you do something when you are not certain the world will allow it, but you have decided to do it anyway. Selene turned her hand over beneath Mara's and held on. There is a particular kind of courage that lives not in grand gestures but in choosing, despite everything that has been taken from you, to remain open. Mara had spent 3 years closing. Selene had spent a lifetime going silent. And yet here, in the most unlikely place, in the most constrained circumstances, surrounded by fluorescent lights and concrete and all the mechanisms of a system designed to diminish, here, they chose each other. Not loudly, not with declarations, with a hand on a table in a small library, and the long exhale of two people who have finally, after a very long time alone, found somewhere to land. Mara's release came 8 months before Selene's. The morning she left, she stood at the entrance of cell block D and looked back one last time. Selene was standing at the far end of the corridor, arms at her sides, watching her with those storm-colored eyes that held every word they had ever exchanged, and every silence between them. Mara pressed one hand flat against her own chest. Over her heart, their signal, the one they had never discussed but both understood, and Selene mirrored it without hesitation. Then Mara walked out into the pale morning light and carried Selene with her, in the only way she could, until the day she could carry her home. She rented a small apartment. She found work. She rebuilt slowly, the way you do when everything has been taken apart and you are choosing, deliberately, which pieces to put back. She wrote to Selene every week, real letters, on paper the kind that required stamps. Selene wrote back in that same careful, small, heartbreaking handwriting. They planned, in those letters, a life that was modest and specific, and full of the kind of detail that only people who have survived scarcity allow themselves to imagine. If this story has moved you, if somewhere in these two women's silence and survival and love you have recognized something true about human longing, please leave a comment below. Tell us what this story made you feel. Your words matter more than you know, and they remind us that these stories deserve to be told. 8 months after Mara walked out, Selene did too. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way except that it wasn't. Mara was waiting outside the gate. She had been there for an hour before the doors opened. When Selene stepped out, she stopped walking for just a moment, the way you stop when something you have been holding in your body finally releases. And then she crossed the distance between them and Mara took her hands, those raw-wristed, long-survived hands, and held them like something she had been trusted to keep safe. They stood there in the plain daylight, two women who had found each other in the dark, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. Some things are too large for words. Some love is built entirely out of the spaces between them, and it is the strongest kind there is, the kind that needs no performance, no announcement, no permission, the kind that simply quietly endures.